Hi, and welcome to an extremely interesting topic. Today I'm going to talk about Africa, the forgotten land, a land so rich but yet so poor. In my humble opinion, Africa has been one of the greatest tragedies of the modern history, especially during the 20th and the 21st century. In this session, I'm going to explain how and why the reasons for my claim that that it is one of the most oppressed lands that we've witnessed in recent history. Along with, I'll be giving solutions to how we can go forward. To begin with, when we look at Africa as a landmass geographically, we can fit Spain, France, Germany, United States, Italy, Switzerland, Eastern Europe, India, China, Japan, and the UK all into Africa. That's how big it is on the map. It is rather underestimated the potential of Africa in terms of its geography. And from this diagram, you realize that how much potential there is in terms of even when it comes to bioeconomy, which I often discuss. You can fit the United States, Europe, India, Japan, and China if you just look at the big land masses, all in Africa. When we look at the resources within Africa, the global resources, where are the minerals? 88% of the platinum and rhodium of this planet are in Africa. 42% of the phosphorus is found in Africa. 40% of the world's gold is found in Africa. 35% of the chromium is found in Africa. And 27% of the aluminium is found in Africa. According to some other statistics, for the in terms of global production, 72% of the platinum you find in Africa. 50% of the cobalt you find in Africa. 50% of the world's diamonds are in Africa. 46% of the chromium and 40% of the bromine. Along with, and I've not even touched upon the petroleum, natural gas, crude oil, etc. All these other things like cocoa beans, which I'll touch upon in a while. Um, Copper, aluminium, I think I mentioned. There's so much potential in Africa and South Africa, but well, we'll discuss the irony in a second. But another thing I would like to add is that even the richest man in history, Mansa Musa of Mali, was from Africa. When you look at his wealth in comparison to the richest, wealthiest people of today, even the likes of Bill Gates and you know, the fortunes of the Rothschild family, so the family dynasty, banking dynasty, Rockefeller, his industrial empire. Mansa Musa's Mali of Mali was far superior than these. And so what we realize is that in terms of land, Africa dwarfs the rest. In terms of minerals, it is far superior than any other place. In terms of natural resources, also, other natural resources is far superior. In terms of wealth, the most wealthiest person in throughout history was from Africa. And so it begs the question, something just doesn't make sense. It begs the question that how can you have so much? How can you be so rich but yet so poor? How can you have so much resources? Because historically, those that have had the most resources have been also been the most wealthiest and most affluent. So why is it the case that Africa has so much but yet it's not so well off? And so let me put this into perspective. If we look at the situation in Africa, in terms of the economy, the water, the food, the energy crisis, climate change, and the land, you know, as you can see from this diagram, the most of the globe, if you look at most of the globe in comparison to Africa, they are much better in terms of GDP per capita. So that's how much money each person has on per person on that in that place. And the least affluent are those that are based in Africa. If you look at the landmass of Africa in this diagram, you see that most of them live on less than $1,000 a year, as far as I can gather. This, although this is from 1995, and it just begs the question: how can you have this disparity? How can you have so much resources and then so little wealth in the same land? Moreover, when you look at the hunger map, the projections and what they're showing is that, again, when you look at Africa, when compared to the entire globe, you realize how much starvation there is, how much of the population is malnourished. And so, in the countries in Africa, largely 35% or over are malnourished. They don't have enough to eat, despite all the things that I showed earlier on. And then you look at the where the food comes from. You look at your food industries. Essentially, 10 corporations own most of the food that we see in our shelves. And then when we break that down even further to where most of the things are sourced from, you see, for example, in a Kit Kat, the only thing that's in the UK is the wheat, milk, and butter. Other than that, the soy comes from Argentina, the whey powder comes from New Zealand, the palm oil comes from Malaysia, the cocoa comes from West Africa, Ivory Coast, and the sugar comes from the Caribbean, salt comes from China, yeast comes from the EU, plaster of Paris, which is also used to give it that crunchy, biting, the feeling in your mouth. It's actually plaster of Paris, which comes from India. And so we live in a globalized world where ingredients come from all over the place. But the key thing that I wanted to point out was when we look at the net chain of where things are coming from and where they're going to, you realize that a lot of the countries on the peripheries are from Africa, are basically African countries, and a lot of the things are coming from Africa and they're being sucked into ultimately France, Germany, or the US, the United States. UK, followed by the Netherlands and UK, and then they are linked to other developed countries. But what you have to realize is that there's a maldistribution of wealth. It's not proportion to the resources, which is how it should be. Now, when we look at the energy in Africa, the energy crisis there, if you look at the United States, the energy production generation is far superior than the population. And when compared to other places, for instance, even China. So in China, the population far exceeds the energy production capacity. So that is to say, there's far less energy available than is required by the people. In Japan, it's the other way around. In Japan, it's similar to United States. They produce far more electricity than the population require. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, in Brazil, and the key one is Africa. If you look at Africa, it's astonishingly the other way around. There's far little energy produced, far little energy produced than the population of Africa. 75% of the people living in third world African nations have no access to electricity, and that is a astonishing, fact. 11 countries in Africa, more than 90% of the people go completely without electricity. So in 11 countries, more than 90% of the people go completely without electricity. again, that's an astonishing fact, especially for a day and age in which we live in. Africa has the lowest per capita energy use of any continent. Each day, New York City consumes the same amount of electricity as sub-Saharan African nations combined, excluding South Africa. Again, that's an astonishing fact. New York is just a city. It's a dot on a map when it compared to the landmass of Africa, like I showed earlier on. And as the IEA chief economist mentioned, Faith Birol, this crisis in Africa is very bad and is something that the energy community and others should be ashamed of. And this is the reality. African soil contains an estimate of 18% of the world's recoverable uranium. The two reactors in South Africa account for 5% of the energy generation. Okay, people in Africa, they have so much, and this is the dichotomy. It's a land so rich, but yet so poor. Now, to see this visually, I mean, you just need to look at this map, a bird's eye view of the globe, or a satellite view, and you see how little energy there is in Africa, despite it being the source of energy for the planet and globe. And this is the disparity, this is the dichotomy, and this is what you call oppression. This is where um, we live in a century and the previous centuries, so to speak, essentially after capitalism, where there has been injustice to places like Africa. And so justice needs to be restored. I mean, there's more injustice now with people buying land off Africa, so people just buying off their land and using it as their own back gardens to do what they like, leading to more um, oppression, in my opinion. People say it's good for the economy, but the reality is it's not. It's long-term oppression because the people of Africa do not own their resources. Now, it's something that Mark Rich mentioned in his book titled The King of Oil. He said that the reason why he was able to build oil refineries in Africa was that people were willing to sell their resources for cheap. But the people that are in the position of authority and sell their resources on the behalf of the people, they need to realize that who are they to be doing that? Often what happens is they tie up the deals with international corporations, and a lot of the money ends up in the hands of the few that are in charge. So a lot of it goes into bureaucrats' pockets, and very little gets filtered back to society and the people. And it's the people's resources and the future generations' resources. It's their right. It's not the corporation that should be owning have entitled to the land and resources. It should not be other countries that should have entitled to the land resources. It should be the people that inhabit that land that should be entitled to the wealth and anything that is reaped from those resources, because it's their resources. And so we can spend a long time discussing whether when Africa was colonized, and just basically when they got colonized by the Brits, etc., France, Spain, and they just drew lines and borders and split it up, whether that was responsible. So we can go back in history and we can pick loops and holes into where things went wrong, or we can blame globalization and capitalism and this corporatocracy, or we can blame internal corruption, because if there weren't individuals in those lands willing to sell the resources for cheap, there's no way externally that you can have these things enforced. Or, what I would like to ask the people is, does it even matter? Do we really have time in this stage and in this part of history that we find ourselves in to be going back into history and time and picking holes and playing the blame game? Or can we not move forward? and look at be more focused on growth rather than defense. In my opinion, I believe that the solution lies in social entrepreneurship. As I mentioned in my last series, that in the private sector, in over the last century, the private sector has grown. So the money, if you look at the global economy, if you take it as a hypothetical example of the first circle, the developed countries and the private sectors have grown, whilst the public sector and the developing countries have shrunk over time. I believe that the solution lies in creating more social enterprises whereby you can suck energy, wealth from industries and banks in developed countries and private sectors into developing countries and the public sector. This needs to be based on what you can think of as reverse osmosis. So it needs to draw money out from the developing countries, industries, and corporations and banks and circulate it more back into developing country society. This will create jobs and lead to cheaper food, healthcare, energy, and education. I've given examples, so for those of you that don't know much about this, I've given example of I've given example of this being applied. I mean, in basically the global challenges and opportunities series, in part four, where I've talked about the solutions, I've gone into detail regarding this. So the issue actually isn't with the banking industries in and of themselves, but the philosophy of many of the industrials and bankers. That's what we need to realize. It's not that not enough money is being invested, but the problem is there's not enough being given back appropriately to society. That's the key issue. And they gave the example of One Water, whereby it was an enterprise that basically this sells bottled water on the market, and it uses its profits to then build wells in Africa, and so it's a win-win situation. And there is hope for Africa. I'm very optimistic because there's a lot of people from Africa returning with MBA graduates. But the problem with MBA graduates is that they're often taught to maximize profits. But if the MBA graduates have a social aspect, and this is where the Academy of Champions come in, one of my other projects, where I'm teaching social entrepreneurship. If you can combine the MBAs with a social background or a social aspect to it, then it can be a great, as it's written, plan to return as entrepreneurs. You know, you must return, and this is my message for the African inhabitants of Africa that have gone overseas for education. Once you come back, come back as entrepreneurs. But those of you that are leaving, go with the intention of leaving as coming back as serial social entrepreneurs, because what you seek is seeking you. When you leave for knowledge, you will only gain the knowledge that you have gone out to seek. If you've not gone out to seek the knowledge, and if you just go to seek a job, then all you will get when you come back is a job in a corporation. You will not get the social impact that you desire, so you must go out seeking the knowledge which you desire. And so this is my, I don't know if you want to call it a plea or if you want to call it advice for my African friends, is basically look to become serial social entrepreneurs. Look to help. Look to help your fellow people, and again overcome this thing about nationalism. Um, Having said that, folks, you're all part of a nation now, so focus on your nation, because there's a reason that you were part of that nation or the part of that tribe, because most of it was tribal system prior to this nationalism. And so whatever it is, your tribes and nations, whatever, focus on them, because there's a reason that you were a part of them and you are a part of them. However, do not let it stop you from expanding your ventures. Set up collaborations with other neighboring countries. Spread the knowledge, spread the wisdom, spread the good that you do in your ventures, and look to become an asset. and look to add value. This would be my advice. And the reality is, there's no better way to do it than now. You know, as startup founders, you'll make much more. I gave the example of Yo Sushi with Simon Woodruff. There was also a lady who was part of Vodafone who innovated something much faster. Shireen, she was an Iranian lady who someone presented her as a case study at the University of Manchester business school, and her husband, I think both of them made something in multiples, magnitudes of millions. They invented a technology that was better than what Vodafone had, and then they sold it to Vodafone and made, they made much more than they would have working for Vodafone, both of them for a lifetime. And so now is the time as startup founders to do things faster than a corporation. And the thing is the same whether you want to do it for yourself. So whether you want to do it for yourself, your kids, your community, your country, or humanity, you need to identify. You need to identify the challenges at each level. So greats are aware of the problem at each level and identify and execute solutions at each level. They can find synergetic roles and solve problems at every level. However, currently you may need to, get a job first to solve the first two levels and get some experience to tackle the rest via entrepreneurship. There is no quick fix as such. There is no one set way. It will take time, but you must be active and patient. Um, like I mentioned, selfishness is only thinking about yourself. Selflessness is thinking about yourself first and then others. Foolishness is only thinking about others and neglecting yourself. And so social entrepreneurship is basically thinking about society throughout the spectrum, and that's why I call this a multi-scale application. Under a capitalist system, money makes the world go round. Under a free system, love and passion makes the world go round. And so you have a choice. Passion outlast paycheck. Passion, option A of action, basically is what champions take, what dreamers. If you're hopeful, you're fearless, you're selfless, spiritually alive. You're alive. You're like an alive fish that swims against the tide. Passion always defeats paycheck. This is something to remember. It's not about the quantity. It's about the quality of people. Champions love challenges. If you want to see a rainbow, you have to put up with the rain. If you if you go in search of honey, you can be expect to be stung by bees. And I'm very excited. I've made my decision of where I want to go and what I want to do. And research, in my opinion, research and enterprise is the solution. If you stay in academia, you need to make sure that you do some empowering research and form your own enterprise and not basically be subservient to industry. If you go into industry, you must look to set up your own enterprise in the long run. What future would you like for yourself and your kids? This is something that you always need to bear in mind. Think about the future and your accountability. The decision that you make now will determine your actions and will determine that the actions that you will take. And in 50 years' time, the results will be evident. You'll turn back and look back at your life and you'll see what you've done and the decisions that you made and what were the results. Never in history of mankind has it been easy in my opinion to create a free world. It only takes, I would say, only around 300 selfless, fearless champions to change the course of history. There are too many selfish people, fearful people at the moment. However, that can be changed. You know, I embarked on this journey of social entrepreneurship at very humble levels, with BREC, so which started off as BREC, as Biodiesel Research Enterprise Community, which is only a cog in the machinery. I was only a tiny component of that cog, and I still am a tiny component of the machineries and the system that I'm building. The systems that I've left and the people that I've so-called inspired, well, people say I've inspired them. I hope that people go on to achieve more and inspire more students and more personalities. I, for myself, will look to, I've decided to inspire as many people as I can, as long as I can, until my last breath, and for to do good. For me, this is an exciting year, and I hope it will be a truly exciting, enjoyable, exciting, educational, and empowering journey. And I would love for you guys to pick up social projects, like I mentioned in the Global Challenges and Opportunity series, and I've also highlighted the issues with the topic of Africa today, because these are blueprints that you can see as a reflection of on the globe. And if you choose option A, if you take action, then you'll be contributing to a free world, which is very exciting. If you choose B, business as usual, then the chances are we're either heading towards possibly either a World War III or a global revolution linked to a lack of food on table. A lack of food on the table, when there's not enough to eat, that's when you get to global revolutions, revolts happening. And so the decision is yours. I'll let you decide. But I also want to share with you, how did things get. Some of you pondering, how did things get to such stage? Because for some of you this might be new information, and you might be wanting to know, how did things get to where they are. So for this, you can read a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. But essentially, how countries in Africa were, I would cite them as, were enslaved. They're usually enslaved not only in Africa, is it most of the developing countries. The pattern was essentially the same. Basically, the United States and the affiliates developed their own state-of-the-art research, their technology and enterprises and businesses by acquiring those resources through physical slavery. This is something Malcolm X questioned and challenged, and also tying up deals, such as the petrodollar deal, and that enabled them over time to become known as developed countries, because they were more developed in technology, science, and innovation. The developed country markets a technology, science, or innovation to developing countries. It uses the media to mass market. This is why you've got televisions and you've got these massive brands where you see everywhere these franchises, and they are global corporations. This is the concept behind corporatocracy. Now, the developing country needs that technology, science, and innovation to develop. So therefore, it contacts a consultancy in a developed country. So, for instance, you need bridges, you need roads, you need the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, but you don't know how you can do it. You don't have the know-how. So therefore, you get in touch with the developing country. Now, first thing is, the developed country should be looking now to have their own consultancy, because there's enough talent in the developed countries for them to have that. And the consultancy then, so that was a side note. The consultancy from the developed country sends a team of consultants to the developing countries with an economic hitman. So EHM stands for economic hitman. Economic hitman's job is solely to over forecast financially. Okay. Economic hitmen are high performers in industry, and they're high performers throughout. So they're actually people who are observed closely throughout the performance, throughout schools, high schools, universities. They'll be the ones that will be achieving first class degrees. There'll be people that are under the radar of even intelligence agencies. There will be people that are highly sought after, and also headhunted. An irony is that they become headhunters. But anyhow, They're high performers in industry and have been to business school, so MBA programs. And again, MBA programs are essentially programs created by the corporations to maximize profits. They are programs, it's a programming of individuals to maximize profits on behalf of corporations. And so you do not get personalities that are produced from MBA schools. There's no major personalities from MBA schools. You can look this up in modern history also, modern times in the last century or so, um, where people like Steve Jobs and the great innovators and entrepreneurs of the time, no one, hardly any of them, even Elon Musk, none of them have been to MBA schools. Very rarely has anyone, even in the FTSE 100, been to the MBA schools. There's much more that haven't than have, and so the proof is in the pudding. Anyway, these guys have been programmed to maximize profits and are simply naive and talented individuals who have insecurities and are exploited. They essentially are high performing puppets who need to be reasoned with. Um, they basically, and so what you need is clean consultancies. You need consultancies that don't have these economic hitmen that aren't over forecasting, that charge a reasonable amount, because the developing countries do not have the resources, they don't have the know-how, they don't have the machinery and the equipment, and the finances to lease therefore needs to they need to take a loan. So to if you over forecast, they don't have the ability anyway, but by over forecasting you're getting them in more debt, and that debt is passed on to the people and through taxations. And so one of the solutions, one of the other side notes, is that the developing countries should look to manufacture their own equipment, machinery, and own equipment and facilities. Loans are obtained from large banks or through the IMF, the International Monetary Funds, at high interest rates from developed countries. The return of investment of project for developing countries is extremely high because of the over forecast from these economic hitmen. The production companies contract is owned by corrupt politicians. So yeah, so the production companies within the developing countries, the contracts are owned by corrupt politicians largely, or they're affiliated with corrupt politicians who take a huge bonus or commission from the loans. And this is what Mark Rich mentions in his book, that he was able to exploit these people, these individuals, so they would take their cuts, but then they would hand over the resources to him and his company. And so individuals in the big three, so the big three is what? The big three is the bank, industry, and government. The big three benefit, whilst the working people suffer through high taxation and needed to repay off the loan. The country and society within it degrades, and this is the 7 steps to enslaving a country. And so in life, life is very short. In life, you'll have to make a choice. There's a fine way to distinguish between good and evil. There's a fine line, and the choice will ultimately be yours to make. What I will say is this: that ultimately you have a choice. Your choice will be to be a serious social entrepreneur, to take up that route, or to be an economic hitman or a hitwoman in this day and age, and as we speak. And as for someone sent and brought to life or sent in the 21st century, you need to ask yourself, what is your role at present? And what are you seeking in the future? Success can be obtained through both routes. You can do it through humanity plus ways or humanity minus ways. Positive way or a negative way, you can become successful. The key question is, which way would you like to become successful? And which way would you like to contribute? You can contribute a lot for yourself, or you can contribute for yourself and others, for your family and the future generations. You will ultimately, the ultimate choice that you'll have is to live to serve humanity at large or live to serve a few. And so the decision is yours. And I'll leave it there. And I've given you lots of food for thought and a lot to ponder over. and I hope you will join me on the side of becoming a serious social entrepreneur and becoming an asset to humanity and adding value to society. Thank you for listening.